When designing combat in a game, one of the most important aspects to get right is feedback. Enemies that communicate their actions clearly give players more agency, both methodically and mechanically. I'm going to look at Jedi Survivor today as an example to analyze. First off, I'm going to talk more about high-level enemy behavior and how it can be used to encourage and influence player decision-making. High-level behavior for the sake of this analysis would include things like passive and combat states. These states would encompass low-level behavior and individual actions within them. When designing high-level enemy behavior, the intended gameplay experience should be the highest priority. For example, the passive state on enemies in Jedi Survivor will allow players to choose where and when they engage the fight from, or if they want to engage in battle at all. This is intended to give player agency to engage in fights how, when, and where they want, in turn rewarding a methodical, strategic player. Communicating high-level behavior like this clearly is extremely important, since the distinction between an aggressive enemy and a passive one has a massively different gameplay intention, which has to be very transparent for players. For passive enemies, having hostile enemies act in a non-hostile manner is usually enough, but other feedback just reinforces that behavior to the player, increasing the consistency they have in identifying what state an enemy is in. The enemies in Jedi Survivor will have passive dialogue, and the music is more mellow, and the enemies will generally move at a slower pace or not move at all when they're in a passive state. This behavior is in stark contrast to combat behavior where the intensity is much higher, which is very intentional on the design side. Low-level enemy behavior refers to the moment-to-moment behavior an enemy partakes in, whether that be an attack, a dodge, moving to a point of interest, and so on. For this section, I'm going to focus on attacks, because getting attacks right requires a solid understanding of player communication and feedback. Attacks generally come down to mechanical skill, which requires clear feedback to convey the attacks to the player, testing the player's reaction time, decision-making, and overall combat capability. Enemy attacks can be broken up into three main states: a tell state, an action state, and a recovery state. The tell state will communicate to the player that an attack is imminent, often with an animation. A melee enemy may wind up for a swing, while a ranged enemy may kneel and scope in to line up a shot. The tell is more than just showing an enemy preparing to attack, however, but also for communicating what type of attack is imminent. In Jedi Survivor, unblockable attacks are communicated with a red overlay on the attacking enemy, telling the player that they have to dodge or jump out of the way of an attack rather than block. If an attack demands a unique response, then that needs to be communicated, which Jedi Survivor does well with these unblockable attacks. These tells for enemy attacks should also vary in animation and length. Differentiating attack tells allow the player to learn an enemy's moveset over time, which encourages and rewards mastery of combat. The animation plays a huge part in this though, and having visually distinct tells for different attacks is crucial for communication. If a ground slam tell is misinterpreted as a punch, it feels unfair for players, as they could have reacted in time, but confused the tell for a different attack. Often, over-exaggerating enemy motions during a tell is key to communicate an attack to the player. A big wind-up for a melee attack and a large airborne jump for a ground slam will differentiate these attacks from one another, allowing the player to react accordingly. And next up is the action state. The action state is the attack itself. If hit, the player will endure a punishment, typically being damaged. This state is also the most important emotionally because it hinges on the previous tell state in order to avoid frustration. If the tell is too short, for example, it can feel very unfair for the player if they take damage. Also, attacks should have counters, and the counters for them should be in the player's toolbox, if of course it's intended that they can defeat the enemy. Players process information and prepare to counter during the tell state. Then they enact that counter during the action state. A melee enemy will swing, the player will dodge. Sometimes the action state can consist of multiple chained actions too, requiring higher mechanical skill from the player while simultaneously delaying the enemy's recovery state. These are more common on stronger, imposing enemies, as chained actions will demand a lot more player attention during a fight. And for conveying feedback for an attack, the main thing to communicate to the player is if they were hit. This is primarily done through the player character rather than the enemy, as a fail will result in damage and a success in avoiding it. The health bar dropping, the character getting staggered, and all other feedback with the health system will do a lot of the heavy lifting, while other feedback from the enemy itself will just reinforce that feedback. Finally, the recovery state. This state happens after an enemy has finished their attack, which will give the player a window to counterattack. The recovery state is essentially a time frame that the player needs to act on to get the reward of dealing damage. And this time frame becomes more common the more times the player sets themselves up properly to capitalize on it. Communicating to the player that an enemy is in this vulnerable state is also important, so players can learn how and when to damage enemies in an intuitive way. Typically, this is done with animation, conveying a stunned or disoriented enemy. This state can also be communicated very well with audio and VFX, especially when fighting multiple enemies at once. These three states come together to create an enemy attack, which when added to a state machine with multiple different attacks, can create compelling enemies to fight. And none of these states can function as intended without some solid player communication. Another thing worth talking about when it comes to feedback is enemy reactions to the player. Having enemies react to things the player does is important to add weight to the player's actions, as well as increase the agency of the player both in and out of combat. The best example from Jedi Survivor is the block meter, which is a mechanic that applies to all enemies in the game. As the player attacks an enemy, the block meter will diminish, and when it's empty, the enemy is put into a vulnerable state. This mechanic not only rewards the player for landing multiple attacks on an enemy, but also adds enemy reactions to the player's blocked attacks. This is actually very clever combat design, since no matter if the player deals damage or not, the enemy will always react to a hit attack in a manner that affects gameplay in a positive way for the player, making all attacks satisfying to land due to the reaction of the enemy and their UI elements updating to reflect the hit. So overall, having intentional high-level behavior and well-crafted attacks are the backbone to good enemy design. And a massive part in designing these enemy actions and behaviors is player communication. Giving players the agency to clearly strategize their combat approach, communicating different actions with distinct tells, and making it clear when the enemy is vulnerable to counterattacks are all examples of feedback. Jedi Survivor does a great job with enemy communication, which results in very engaging gameplay that is easy to learn and hard to master.